Uno, dos. Okay. Buenas tardes. Boa tarde. Good afternoon. There was a room change. This is the cannabinoid and psychedelics session. In case you want to be in a different one, stay here. Before I start, two things to the people here. Sort of an announcement. I will be talking in a minute or so about a taxonomy that will be published in this journal, Psychology of Consciousness, which I am the incoming editor. And there are about 10 or so different issues in the back of the room. So if you're interested in it, you can grab one. And we also have a call for papers on all aspects of consciousness, basically. Not just neurobiology, but if there's neurobiology related to some measure of consciousness, that will count. So for the presenters, do you know if the person who was missing, did that person arrived? No? All right. Well, Anass is not here. Okay. Well, I am about to start, and I will be also chairing the session. So for the presenters, I will give you, we have 25 minutes in total. And we're supposed to talk for about 20 minutes and 5 minutes of questions. I will be ruthless. I have pages there. When you have reached your 15 minutes, I will give you 5 minutes, and then 2, 1, and stop. If you go beyond your 20 minutes, that will take time out of the questions. Now, it is possible if there is a presenter that does not show up, apparently there is one who has not shown up, that we will have more time, but we cannot be sure at this point. So, welcome to the session. My name is Etzel Cardeña. I am another Mexican, the same as Yvette Fuentes, but via US, Canada, US, Sweden, and the Netherlands. And I will be talking about a multidisciplinary consensus taxonomy of states of consciousness. And there in my first slide, what you see is that there is et al, because this is not only my work, it is the work of many people, and those are the 15 other people. And one thing that I want to draw your attention to is that it was a wide international consensus group, 10 different nations, experts in cognitive neuroscience, neurobiology, anthropology, religious studies, psychiatry, and maybe a couple that I cannot remember. So we got together, we fought with each other very amiably for a while to come to what we thought would be a development of a new taxonomy. Because one of the things that we believe is that taxonomies are essential to have a science. Biology made giant strides once Linnaeus ended up coming up with a taxonomy of plants and animals. And we do not have anything like that for states of consciousness. What we end up having is either, generally speaking, people talking about triggers as if they were states. So you will hear that people will mention there is the psychedelic state or the hypnotic state or the meditative state. And even though I do research in all three, well, not so much on psychedelics, but on those two plus other states of consciousness, that doesn't make any sense to me. Why? First, and now I will go through this. Por cierto, si hispanoparlantes no me pueden seguir en algo, me preguntan después de la sesión y les digo en español. Back to English. First, they presume homogeneity of effects. So, for instance, in the case of hypnosis, what a person is going to experience depends to a large degree on what you tell the person, what instructions you give. The same thing with meditation, and of course we know that to a large degree the same thing happens with psychedelics. So, number one, they presume homogeneity of effects. That is not really true. Number two, they minimize the importance of individual difference that are based on traits and/or experience. Let me talk about hypnotic state. which again does not exist such a thing, I can do the same exact procedure with 2 different people, let's say 3 different people. A highly hypnotizable people, and there are ways to measure this, a highly hypnotizable people will respond, start experiencing to a large degree the suggestions I'm giving him or her. Their physiology will start changing. A person who has medium hypnotizability will experience to a degree, but probably will also be thinking, well, I was not fully experiencing that. And the low hypnotizable, the person who, as a trait, is not very responsive to hypnotic suggestions, will be thinking, I'm really bored, when is this going to end? Number 3, some states produced by different inductions are very similar. I have a paper coming out where I compare reports from psychedelic experiences and hypnotic experiences with very highly hypnotizable, and they are indistinguishable. Psychedelics, of course, tend to be more intense, they last longer, but as far as the experiential phenomenological report, they are indistinguishable. And even for the same person in the same context, there may be differently recognizable states. So when a person talks my psychedelic experience, there were many things that happened during that event. So because of all of that, we ended up coming with, and this was through a number of transactions and discussions and so on, with a taxonomy that follows taxonomic principles. We wanted to be at a level of what one might consider species, that is distinguishable characteristics, and we came with 8 of them. I will just read them rapidly, and then I will go slowly with each one. Proto and transitional states, or proto-states, delirium, minimal to no awareness, experiential detachment, enhanced physicality, altered identity, imaginal/fantasy/visionary, and unity mystical states. So let's go with the first one. Proto and transitional states refers to very short transitions between one state and the other. And let me mention that even though the taxonomy is phenomenological, we ended up emphasizing the phenomenology. That's what we are based on. We also did some research on the phenomenology associated with these states. I will not go into that, but if there is time in the questions, you can ask me something about it. So what kind of proto-states or transitional states or small living states in between stable states, what kind of examples can we talk about? For example, auras or prodromal in epileptic states. So people, as they are going into a seizure, may start experiencing hunches that something is about to happen, have tingling sensations, see lights, have unusual smells. The 1.2 transitional dizziness or confusion. And here I would give as an example what tends to happen often as people enter into a ritually induced or spirit possession state where before they end up becoming a different identity, a kind of state that I will talk about later, they may just be confused and may fall down on the floor. And at that state, they seem to be very little reactive to what happens. And the one, even if, for those of you who have not been possessed by the spirits, the one that all of you have experienced is going into and out of sleep, hypnagogic and hypnopompic states. And one thing that we know is that they are associated with somatic sensations, with bizarre imagery. And I'll give you an example of them. Hypnagogic state, which is the state from being awake to being asleep. A person said, for example, the blood turned into what looked like cocktail sauce that's served with shrimps. And then little shrimps started appearing. So as you are falling asleep, if you have had really bizarre thoughts and you thought you were something else, welcome to the largest club. You're perfectly normal. It tends to happen. Sleep paralysis can be thought of as a proto-state where you are awaking and your brain/consciousness has woken up. But the sleep paralysis that is mediated by midbrain structures has not quite lifted. So the person cannot move even though he or she feels widely awake. An example from Solomonova is, I was sleeping and couldn't move. There was a terrifying figure looming over me. And I suspect that there are many other examples, for instance, going into and out of anesthesia and so on, that we need to explore more. We know that there is a bit of literature on people who have DID, dissociative identity disorder, who are going from one identity to the other. They seem to also be somehow cognitively unstructured, disorganized. So that is proto-transitional type of states. Number 2, this one I hope nobody has experienced, delirium. And delirium, it has 2 main types. One is agitated, where the person has very vigorous behavioral activity, may have hallucinations, may have delusions, has problem expressing him or herself or understanding what is going on around them. This may alternate with a somnolent type of delirium, in which the person goes from being frenetic and flaying around on the floor or up here to being very slow, to being inactive, to seemingly being unreactive, and to being confused. And delirium is typically associated with some kind of neuropathology. So this is not something that is very likely. I could not find an example of non-pathological types of states. So that is number 2. And number 3 here, we have things that we have all experienced, and it has to do with having minimal to no awareness. And by minimal or no awareness or being unresponsive, we are referring to awareness of what we might consider the consensual physical surroundings. So the first subtype is no awareness of stimuli, or we assume there is no ongoing subjective experience. So this would be, for example, types of coma in which the person not only does not seem to be unresponsive, but as far as we can tell, and Steve Loris, which is a world authority on these topics, was one of the authors of the taxonomy, says, as far as we can tell, there does not seem to be any type of ongoing experience, independently of whether the person is responsive to what occurs. Then 3.2, this is something that we have started finding out in the last few years, is that people may have too minimal to no awareness, but we are not quite certain to what extent they are having ongoing experiences. For instance, dream-like type of events. We are not quite so sure. By minimal, they may be mildly responsive to stimuli, and this is evaluated by both behavioral responses to a doctor, a clinician giving them some prompts, or by looking at neurodynamic responses. And we are not quite sure to what extent people are having autonomous, ongoing experiences. And number 3, this is something that, again, you and all of us have had, and it is minimal or no awareness of stimuli and ongoing experience, sometimes very rich ongoing experience. And this, what I'm referring to, one of the examples that I'm going to give you is dreams. In the case of dreams, we are minimally to not to unaware of stimulus. And I would say minimal, because to an extent, of course, we respond to. If you're a parent and your baby is crying, even though it seemed like you were completely zonked out, you will react, you will respond. And we are having a very rich type of ongoing experiences. In the case of ongoing experience during sleep, we all have examples, instances of dreams. So I did not make a slide of dreams. You all can get yours tonight. But lucid dreams are not as common. And a lucid dream is one in which a person is aware of sleeping while they are sleeping. They are aware that they are dreaming while they are dreaming. So this is an example of one of the pioneers of this area, Stephen LaBerge. in a chapter that he has in our book, Varieties of Anomalous Experience. And he recounts one of his lucid dreams. He says, I dreamed that I was standing on the pavement outside my home. On glancing casually at stones, I noticed that they had seemingly all changed position. Then the solution flashed upon me. I was dreaming. And often, a lucid dream ends up starting when a person in a dream realizes something that is incongruous. So that was number 3 type. Number 4, experiential detachment. And here we were able to identify 2 main types. One, and there was a presentation yesterday on out-of-body experiences, is one in which the person mostly feels that his or her center of consciousness, the self, if you will, is outside of the body. It may be hovering over the body, it might have already detached from the body, and it may be flying away. And of course, these are types of states that come from many different types of triggers. They can occur from out-of-body experiences. Sometimes they happen in shamanism. Sometimes it has happened spontaneously in people I have hypnotized without giving them any specific suggestions. So there is that self out of the body. I will come back to this in a second. And here is an example, 4.1. This is the beginning of a near-death experience. And here, let me make a bit of a parenthesis, because I purposefully wanted to say the beginning of a near-death experience, because I would say that a near-death experience is not a state, a single state. A typical complex near-death experience has a variety of different states, the same as mystical, what typically gets called psychedelic experiences, and so on. So here, Bruce Grayson writes, a person describes, I was out of my body at once and on the ceiling of the operating room, looking down, watching them work on a body. The person I was viewing was me. So that's what the person experiences. So that is hovering outside of the body. And as was mentioned yesterday, there is no correlation between having out-of-body experiences or pathology. Most anomalous experiences are not associated particularly with pathology. The second, estrangement from the self or the environment, is something that is partly associated with psychopathology, mostly dissociative psychopathology, but it can happen to all of us. And I chose the example I'm going to give to you because it comes from someone like probably a number of you and me at least some years ago, from students who were doing medicine and psychology. And estrangement from the self or the environment is an experience in which you felt detached from what is going around you. A firefighter told us, remembering what had happened the previous day when he was carrying bodies, that he felt as if he had watched it in a TV instead of doing it himself. So there is a sense of detachment or unreality from the self or the environment. And here is 4.2. I felt totally estranged, meaning distance. I felt totally estranged from all things and people. I felt dazed, which is confused, and detached. So that is one type that is mostly having to do with your sense of body. The one that we ended up coming sort of recently, as we were about to say we are done with it, was something that shamefully is the reason why I got into this area, because I experienced this a number of months ago, and I did not think of adding it, and it is enhanced physicality. And there are a variety of different types. One, that the person may have a sense that his or her perception has greatly improved, and or that his or her agility is much greater than it would happen ordinarily, which is what occurred to me. But let me give you a first example of enhanced perception. This is from Michael Murphy's book, The Future of the Body, and he is quoting a golf professional, and he says, well, I saw a golf hole, and suddenly looking, and the golf hole are this big, and it was suddenly looking as if it was as big as a washtub. So it seemed as the perception suddenly greatly increased. Now, an example The other type of enhanced physicality that has been studied to a large degree is a sense of intense energy and or heat. That the person feels there is great energy, heat, vibration of the body. And this is, for instance, example I gave to you, Kundalini experiences, what are called Kundalini experiences. So in a study by Wade, one of the participants says, I am in the body, there is pure crackling, surging, grinding, burning energy. And if you want to get a bit, if you will, into whether this may relate to physiological changes as well, there have been observations of people not only having the experience of heat, but actually having warmer bodies when they engage in, for example, Tummo meditation in Tibet. So enhanced physicality is the other type. Next one, altered identity. And altered identity, we found 3 types. One, the first one was changed identity, but without becoming somebody else. This is what sometimes is called trans, a term I do not like, unless you circumscribe it and define exactly what you mean. But it refers to a sense that your identity has changed. You do not have a narrative sense of self. You feel that you have lost control and you are engaging in a lot of stereotypical behaviors. So, for example, an anthropologist talking about his own experience wrote, the surrounding scene started to vanish. The sensation of a force invading me. I was not dancing. And he was in the midst of a ritual and he himself felt that he became possessed. So, change identity without an alteration into a different identity. Type 2, co-consciousness, 2 simultaneous ongoing consciousness. And this you find a lot in mediumship or channeling, things of that sort, and it refers to simultaneous multiple identities or simultaneous identities. So in the case of a medium, the person tells they meaning the spirits, they often tell me that they are sending me information in the form of frequency. And apparently the person is having a simultaneous sense of his, in this case her, of her identity and the identity of others. And the final example, or the final type, is when an identity is substituted by another identity. And this refers to dissociative identity disorder, to spirit possession. Most spirit possessions are perfectly fine. Most people who are in ritually spirit possessions, as research has shown, are even healthier, or at least as healthy as the referent group. So people can go into different identities sometimes, have another identity substitutes theirs. Sorry, there's a typo there. And oftentimes this also goes along with amnesia. So in a study that we did in Uganda on dissociative disorders, one of the respondents was describing that the daughter of a father was killed, and then she started to talk with his voice and behaving as if she had become him. And she would say, "Bring my cigarettes," meaning the father asking for the cigarettes. That it seemed that she had become him for a while. So that is the 6th. 2 more to go. And by the way, even though we have defined it as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and the first 2, and particularly the second one, delirium, is pathological, there is no sense of hierarchy here. We do not assume that. Imaginal fantasy visionary, first start with simple imagery. In any kind of sensory modality, like lights, geometric forms. For example, the person in one of my hypnosis studies talks about lines of different colors making music. And there was nothing, it was in a completely dark, silent room. Or complex imagery. The person oftentimes goes from simple imagery, as happens in a lot of psychedelic reports, to complex imagery, to things that look at narrative visions, small personal movies. The person is in an immersive reality that can have with or without reflective awareness. And here in a visionary, first I'll start with, and I won't say where it comes from, except for the reference. I see all the dead, I see my relatives, they fly on a white cloud to me, where I am, and communicate with me. They are not visible at all. And then here's another quotation. I saw a man coming toward me. He seemed to have no feet. He just floated toward me out of a mist. Now, the first one, the Altman, is that from a shamanic or a psychotic person? Please raise your hand if it is from, you think it's from a shamanic experience. 1, 2, a few people. 3. Thank you. No, it comes from a description of a person with psychosis. The next one, from John Halifax, is from a shamanic experience, but I chose them specifically, how similar they are. And having unusual experiences per se tells you very little to nothing about whether a person really has dysfunction. And finally, I'm about to finish. We started 5 minutes late, and I won't take questions so that I don't take anybody's time. It's unity or mystical experiences. And with this, we don't use mystical experience to meaning weird, unusual, altered state. One can be far more precise on how one uses it. William James, in 1819, Principles of Psychology, made that mistake. He starts saying a mystical experience, and he talks about, well, it's out-of-body experiences and religious experiences and spiritual and occult, and he just threw everything and the kitchen sink there. But by Varieties of Religious Experience, 1902, he had really focused on something more specific. So the cornerstone of unity or mystical experiences are a sense of unity, a sense that one is connected with something much larger than one is. David Yaren would see also that there is a decrease of egoic importance, of your sense of a presence. And there are 2 main types, with sensory experiences and pure consciousness. And with sensory experiences, they have to deal with a sense of merging with a larger whole, enhanced perception, merging with the light, seeing a bright light. By the way, this comes from all types of different triggers. An author found 13 different triggers. So it does not only happen with psychedelics. It can happen completely spontaneously. If you are to be shot the following day, tomorrow, you may have a mystical experience. May not be the best circumstance to have a mystical one, or maybe it is the best one, but it may happen in those. So an example of a mystical experience with sensory experience is I became absorbed into the background, meaning the whole world, without any separate entity. And there is also a sense of pure consciousness, which is just being pure awareness without any content of it. So maybe a sense of vacuum or nothingness. And here is an example from the literature on meditation. There was no sense of my physical body, no thought. So I am about finished. I'll skip on this for the interest of time, but I would say that we need a good taxonomy and that we do not have one, which is why we came up with this. And we are continuing to do this. We are going to test our taxonomy through large language modeling, and we are supported by the Tiny Blue Dot Foundation. We're also developing and comparing a dimensional approach to altered states, where we will integrate the ordinary state. And we are also integrating the phenomenological categories to neurodynamics, in what one might call neurophenomenology. We want to also evaluate the cross-cultural validity of what we do. And the most important thing is, if there are people here who do work on this, test it. See how useful it is for what you're doing. That is really the most important. If you have other suggestions, I'm out of time. You can write to me. If you want to download that paper, there is the DOI. So if you want, or you can write to me and I will send you the link. So that's easy to do. So thank you for your attention. I will take no questions because I went over my time, but I can take questions later. So thank you. Thank you. And remember, please, can you present yourself? I think it's easier. Thank you. Oh, the clicker. Is the...
I'm Keith Heinzerling. In my day job, I'm a physician, do clinical trials of psychedelics, primarily for mental health indications, depression, anxiety. But today I'm going to be talking about something that we've been working on outside of our primary professional responsibilities, which is application of psychedelics for modern spiritual activation and initiation. The talk's dedicated to Dr. Robert Gilbert, who was one of my spiritual teachers. He passed away in February. He articulated much of the model and that I'm talking about today and asked us to see if we could continue working with it after his passing, which is why I'm here today. Psychedelics may produce profound, mystical, and even transformative experiences, but how can these experiences be best applied for good? Psychedelics can be considered non-specific amplifiers, and therefore an important question is, what are you amplifying with a psychedelic, and is the end result likely to be helpful or harmful? While the focus of current modern use of psychedelics in this so-called renaissance is primarily on healing and medical or therapeutic applications, at least in the developed world, psychedelics have long been used to connect with and better comprehend and understand humanity's place within the greater context of the natural and spiritual worlds. Examples of this include indigenous and shamanic use of psychedelics in ritual and ceremonial settings, as well as modern research such as the Good Friday experiment in 1962, where Walter Pahnke studied the effects of psilocybin on religious experience of divinity students attending Good Friday ceremonies, to the recently published Johns Hopkins and NYU study of psilocybin in 24 US religious leaders. While individual healing and therapy with psychedelics is clearly important, the potential of psychedelics to benefit individuals, humanity, nature, the planet, and beyond extends well beyond individual healing applications. But the lack of a modern model and framework for going beyond healing with psychedelics has created an environment where many people are trying psychedelics without preparation or a context to allow them to interpret or integrate the experience, and others who are aimlessly going from one psychedelic experience or one psychedelic medicine to the other, often at high doses in a cycle of unfulfilled healing. Such approaches are unlikely to support sustained personal, emotional, and spiritual growth and development. We've been working on what we call the Psychedelics for Spiritual Activation model to provide a modern framework for utilizing psychedelics to enhance one's own spiritual development in order to understand how to be of greatest service to ourselves, our community, humanity, and the planet. The model was originally articulated by Dr. Gilbert, as I mentioned. The model, as we present it, presupposes that psychedelics are not only pharmacologic agents that act on the brain, but also enhance the ability of humans to perceive and experience non-physical or non-local aspects of reality. In the talk today, I'll illustrate the model, how it can be applied by describing work we've been doing, hosting what we call Beyond Healing Spiritual Activation Retreats. In this work, we've been employing our own specific metaphysical and cosmological model within the framework, but the model itself can be applied to a variety of different metaphysical and cosmological systems and is not intended to be specific to any one spiritual, religious, or scientific tradition or lineage. The model consists of 4 stages. First is healing, addressing physical, emotional, mental, and higher level issues, thereby clearing the way for deeper spiritual work. This may be achieved using a variety of healing modalities, including medical, psychological, energetic, or spiritual methods, and may be done with or without psychedelics. While healing is a critical first step, many people seem stuck in a cycle of healing without a clear goal and an endpoint in mind for the process. Next is activation, focused in our case on activating the subtle bodies, the traditional chakras, and other energy centers and circuits, enhancing direct spiritual perception through the combination of moderate psychedelic doses with meditative and spiritual practices. These practices are learned ahead of time prior to applying psychedelics. Enhanced spiritual perception is intended to be a tool for understanding ourselves and the greater context of who we are, why we're here, and what we hope to do to be of service in this life. While our application involves spiritual activation, healing and activation could potentially be replaced within the model with more physicalist or non-spiritual terms such as therapy or consciousness expansion or personal development. And therefore, again, it's not intended to be specific to one spiritual approach. Next is stabilization, developing, structuring, and sustaining enhanced consciousness through ongoing spiritual practices, mostly without psychedelics, but potentially returning to psychedelics occasionally for support as needed. This is similar to the concept of integration in psychedelic therapy, but is more, in our case, oriented towards energetic stabilization and consciousness stabilization as opposed to trying to integrate personal, emotional, or personal material, which is typical in a therapy approach. Last is application, applying our newfound spiritual insight, wisdom, or abilities to our own life to be in service to others, fostering societal well-being and one's own evolution as well as potentially the evolution of humanity. By placing application and service at the endpoint and ultimate purpose of psychedelic experiences, the model aims to provide a framework to maximize the potential of psychedelics for good. The metaphysical framework that we employ in our model is the four-part subtle body model, including the physical level, the etheric or energetic level, the astral, mental or emotional level, and the highest level, the spirit core or capital E, ego. Each of these levels within an individual is conceptualized to be pinched off from a larger universal plane or dimension such that it's possible to directly perceive and experience sensations within one's own subtle body as well as in the larger universal or collective consciousness plane. Within this model, psychedelics are tools for increasing and enhancing one's ability to directly perceive and experience these energies and sensations. The four-part subtle body model fits well with the subjective and phenomenological experience of psychedelics, which typically spans experiences that could be categorized as physical, energetic, mental, emotional, and/or spiritual. In combining moderate doses of psychedelics with meditative practices, the concept is to gain control over the physical, energetic, mental, and emotional levels in order to clear the way for subsequent direct experience of what is presumed to be a higher spiritual dimension or realm. People sometimes have psychedelic experiences and perceive that they may have received a message from God or some insight that gives them the meaning of life, but oftentimes, particularly early in psychedelic work, this may be their own personal, mental, or emotional material that's emerging. But if one can push through or past personal and collective mental and emotional material, it may be possible to experience something akin to the underlying framework or pure consciousness. As an example of the model being applied, I'd like to describe our first experience working with the model, hosting our first Beyond Healing spiritual activation retreat, which occurred last April. This was a spiritual retreat and not a research study, so I'm only able to describe the program with some general data. We do hope to complete a more formal research evaluation or work with some of these concepts in a more controlled research environment in the future. The objective of the retreat, as presented to participants, was to assist people who had completed sufficient initial emotional and mental healing work to use meditation and spiritual practices augmented by moderate dose psychedelics to learn to directly perceive the spiritual. The retreat was attended by 12 participants and hosted by myself and 4 other leaders. Applications to the retreat came from announcements on Dr. Gilbert's social media and email list, and potential participants were screened for appropriateness with a questionnaire and then interviews by myself and one of my colleagues, Karina Sergi, who is a therapist. Participants were requested to have significant experience in the past with meditation and also with psychedelics. They had to report at least 3 past psychedelic experiences and no adverse experiences with psychedelics. Perhaps most importantly, we advised people that they should have completed some basic emotional and personal healing and development work. And if they were seeking an experience aimed at emotional processing or healing, they should not attend. We didn't employ a formal measure, and I'm not certain I know if there is one, frankly, to assess readiness for spiritual activation, but this is something that would be interesting to pursue in the future. Also, while the model emphasizes completion of healing prior to undergoing activation, it's not in practice a linear process. And when people proceed through activation, stabilization, and application, that often will reveal more material that can then be worked with in a healing modality. After the 12 participants were selected, they met with myself and colleagues online for some preparatory sessions to build group dynamics, answer logistical questions about the retreat, and also to help them with some of the prerequisites. They were advised to do 2 online courses that covered some of the meditation practices before arriving at the retreat. The retreat was held at a private retreat center in Mexico. It was 5 days of lectures, discussions, and group spiritual practices with and without psychedelics. Morning sessions introduced the material and practices without psychedelics, and afternoon sessions combined psychedelics with group meditation on days 2 through 5. The psychedelic for the retreat was psilocybin mushrooms. Participants self-administered the medicine and were free to decline using the psychedelic. If they chose to forego the psychedelic, they were free to participate in all the retreat activities without medicine. We were curious to see if people would decline since the practices we deemed to be somewhat powerful in and of themselves. A variety of psychedelics could be employed in this model, and we're interested in exploring that in the future, particularly with psychedelics such as DMT, which we think might be very applicable. The purpose of the psychedelic here was to augment and enhance the spiritual practices and facilitate making a direct connection and direct perception of the non-physical. The objective was not shamanic or therapeutic journeying, and as a result, we advised participants that the target dose would be one that produced perceptible effects, in other words, not a microdose, but was not so high that it would pull them away from the practices. Having advised the participants of the idea for the dosing, the target doses, we did not set any arbitrary limit on the dose. We left it up to people. People did follow the advice, though. Among the 12 participants across 4 sessions, the average dose was 2.5 grams, and the range was 1 gram to 7 grams, with a typical psychedelic, heroic, or shamanic dose being about 4 grams. No participant declined in any of the sessions to use the psychedelic, and anecdotally, people reported strong subjective effects and powerful experiences despite ingesting lower doses of the psychedelic compared to their prior experiences, likely due to the emphasis we placed on set and setting within the retreat format. The spiritual and meditative practices themselves are similar to and adapted from a variety of meditative and spiritual traditions. They're aimed at structuring and stabilizing individual and group energy and consciousness to enable facilitating connection with a spiritual level. We explained prior to instead of teaching people just the steps, we strive to explain the purpose of each of the steps and what the purpose of the practice was beforehand. Prior to arriving at the retreat, participants completed an online class that was aimed at helping them to become less reactive to thoughts and feelings We used the 6 essential exercises from Rudolf Steiner's teachings, but any suitable practices could be used there. The next step involves a combination of receptive and active meditation practices aimed at structuring and activating energy centers. For example, one might direct their attention at each of the individual chakras and move their attention into the center of the chakra. Through that process, the energy center becomes activated and more perceptible. And doing that meditation practice in the setting of the psychedelic makes that experience more powerful and the activation more perceptible. One thing, the point of this was to awaken people or initiate people to this experience of direct perception to the spiritual. I use the term initiation in the title. I think it's very important to state that in this case, we're not talking about people being initiated into any group. They're not required to pledge allegiance to any person or any organization. The term here really just applies becoming aware of an experience and being initiated through that experience into awareness or awakening. Okay. There are some important limitations and ethical considerations that I would like to note. First, there's the question of what, if anything, are we connecting to, and is this real? That's a very difficult question for me to answer. And through this work and also being at this conference, frankly, you know, my sense of the boundaries of what we might consider real have been expanded, and I've become more humble the further I work with this material about that definition. Regardless, anecdotal reports as well as research studies have shown that these psychedelic experiences or experiences like this without psychedelics can be highly meaningful to people. And the point of the model is to try to help understand how these experiences can be best directed towards good in the person's life and in the collective. There is a risk that psychedelics could merely be making people more susceptible to suggestion and inappropriately strengthening or reinforcing pre-existing beliefs or biases, or worse, suggestions from leaders or facilitators that may be for the benefit of the leader and not the participant. And so it's really critical in this type of work that there are safeguards against self-serving gurus or formation of cults, which has happened many times in the past, unfortunately. Little of what I'm discussing is novel, and in fact, really what we were trying to do with this model is just pull it together into a framework that might be suitable for modern minds to apply in the modern world. So there is a danger of appropriating knowledge or technology from indigenous communities or other spiritual lineages and systems to ensure respect and reciprocity are needed, especially when plants or fungi that are sacred are involved. Psychedelics also have legal and potential medical risks. Despite interest, psychedelics remain illegal in many or maybe even most jurisdictions, and so there could be legal risks associated with use. Although psilocybin and classic psychedelics have relatively low potential for abuse and addiction, there are possible side effects, including cardiovascular risk or risk of psychological sequelae, including psychosis. And so psychedelics are not for all people in all situations. After the retreat, 11 of the 12, or during the retreat, 11 of the 12 participants completed the entire retreat. One participant left a day early, citing mental and physical fatigue. Since the retreat, we've offered online Zoom, what we call post-activation stabilization meetings for retreat participants to continue to practice the meditations together, go through discussions, and support each other in their spiritual growth and development. 8 to 10 of the 12 participants, depending on the week, have been meeting every 2 weeks, which is a relatively high level of engagement. This is since April. It's a relatively high level of engagement compared to what you might expect for a typical retreat like this. And prior to his passing, Dr. Gilbert had asked us to establish a nonprofit organization to try to support increasing access to this material for people, which we have initiated. Lastly, we plan to continue the work. We're offering another retreat, second retreat, which we're calling Beyond Healing, that will also include some work with sacred geometry, meditation, and psychedelics, and that's in September. And lastly, we hope that we could incorporate more scientifically validated measures and evaluations into some of this work, but it is essentially a spiritual and public service project at the moment, and so that's been the emphasis. Thank you very much, and I'll take a few questions if...
Yeah, we have time for about 2 or 3. 1 and 2, you start. Yes.
Thank you so much for this presentation. I've heard healing, getting the next level, awesome. My friends and I have been working on what is a good name for above microdose and below normal dose. Let me recommend whisper dose.
Whisper, that's good, yes.
So you all heard it here first, it's a whisper dose.
There is a person behind you that you can give the mic.
We usually call that a meso dose, which is another word for whisper dose. Thank you so much for a beautiful presentation. You were saying that in your screening process, you screened out people who had had adverse psychedelic effects. And 2 questions about that. First of all, how do you define adverse? Over what time scale is an adverse effect? And secondly, when I've been doing screening for similar things, I've been viewing how people have reacted to previous adverse psychedelic effects as an interesting criterion. So I would be super curious to hear your rationale.
Thank you. We were very cautious because this was the first retreat, and I'm a physician and one of the other leaders is a psychologist. So essentially, and we had to rely on self-report. We didn't examine medical records or anything, but essentially we took people who had very few or almost no health problems, were not on psychiatric medications, no serious, significant psychiatric issues in the past, and anyone who had had a medical, who had sought professional help for a reaction to psychedelics in the past, we didn't take. But you know, these were people. Some of the people who had been meditating, deeply involved. Some of the participants were more deeply experienced with spiritual practices than the leaders. So they did not all have like just happy, go lucky experiences with psychedelics. That was allowed, but anyone who sought professional help for an injury, so to speak, was excluded.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Can you introduce yourself? Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Etzel. Hello, everybody. My name is Pascal Michael. I am a part-time lecturer at the University of Greenwich and the ALF Trust. We've actually got I run an option for the module on spiritual psychology at the ALF Trust as part of their MSc in spiritual psychology and transpersonal psychology. So it's an open learning thing, so anyone, you don't have to be a student. Anyone can join, so check that out. So basically what I'm going to be talking to you about today is specific elements of this paper, Navigating Groundlessness. It's basically an interview study of people that had existentially or ontologically challenging or distressing experiences in an enduring manner after their psychedelic experiences. I'm going to be talking about that a little bit, about the qualitative elements of that, but also kind of speculating on some possible neurocorrelates of that, and then further speculating about what the relevance might be of thinking about predictors of these experiences. But basically, this was part of a larger study about a larger study as part of the project on challenging psychedelic experiences. So this was just a particular survey. It started off as a survey, and then we honed in on the people that reported ontologically or existentially distressing experiences, and then we invited some of them to interview, and so this was the result of that, the interview study. So ultimately, let's think about the kind of positive implications, at least, about these, what could be considered like metaphysical type experiences with psychedelics before we get onto the really depressing stuff. So mystical experiences have been shown to be correlated with reduced existential distress and death anxiety. For instance, in some of the largest clinical trials of psychedelics involving psilocybin for end-of-life distress, for instance. And that correlated with enhanced a sense of meaning and purpose in life. And then there's also some other studies, interestingly, saying that it is that alleviation of death anxiety, which is itself one of the more important predictors of the clinical outcome that you see. Also, we see several studies showing that after psychedelics, there is this kind of reliable shift and trend away from physicalism and materialism toward more non-physicalist or materialist beliefs, especially like idealism or panpsychism. And that, in some of those studies, that itself has been shown to correlate with actually enhanced well-being. But there's some caveats to that. But for instance, another study, a big survey of people having entity encounters on DMT, showing that... sorry, perfect. Thanks, Etzel. So a third of the people of that study who consider themselves atheists no longer consider themselves atheists after this particular DMT entity encounter, right? And that itself was also, again, following the pattern, correlated to enhanced meaning, considering it as some of the most meaningful experiences of their life. But interestingly, although it was a very small percentage, it was still 20 people of the survey endorsed that it was really an undesirable shift in their metaphysical beliefs, really, that encounter precipitated. So, what about the challenging implications? So, generally, these kinds of challenging psychedelic experiences can be, or have been, for instance, considered by Stan Grof as one of the most prolific clinical psychedelic therapists and researchers in these kind of frameworks, or the kind of categories that can come out of that, rather, is like this sense of insanity or dying or losing control, or these no exit scenarios, and you'll see that that's going to mirror in what we found as well. But they can more broadly be framed in like these more existential frameworks. For instance, the concept of death and dying, and freedom, responsibility, isolation or connection, and meaningfulness and meaninglessness. Paul Tillich, the theologian, he coined this term ontological shock, which you might be familiar with, and he just sort of it was in more classical religious context, and this sense of the doom of the threat of non-being. And as hopefully you'll see later when I look at the qualitative stuff, yes, sometimes it's the sense of non-being, but it's also about being, like maximal being, like overwhelming being. And I kind of actually forgot to say that why I even called the talk the Widening Gyre is because that is another part, the less quoted part of the beautiful Yeats poem, The Second Coming. Usually what's quoted is the center cannot hold, right? And that's often referred to in like psychosis contexts and things, when the center of your cognition, your consciousness kind of collapses, and hence this groundless kind of state. But Widening Gyre, I think, encapsulates some of these quotes that we'll get into about this sense of expansion, which itself can be problematic for some people. The same DMT entity paper also said, or like kind of put forward this idea that that this ontologically shocking experience can itself be very helpfully conducive to cognitive and psychological flexibility, and that can be like therapeutic. But of course, there's a big yes, maybe for some people, but there's there's a real, it's not a simple jump from ontological shock and, some wonderful cognitive flexibility, which will be salutary for you. There's this integration and a lot of work and understanding needs to go in that. And there's many different examples of different exceptional experiences with other literature showing this difficulties with ontological shock and the like. So I'm going to be talking later about possible neural predictors of these experiences, but we already have psychological predictors. There's quite a lot of studies on that already. So for instance, if you score in your personality trait as being quite low in openness or quite high in neuroticism, low in surrender, or you have sort of difficulty with acceptance or disorganized psychological states, or some other studies showing things like personal or familial history of borderline personality disorder and things like this, or generally with major psychiatric conditions and things, then these can be predictors. But what about neurocorrelates? And then, of these states acutely, and then perhaps, that can be useful for extrapolating what the kind of predictors might be. So generally, psychedelics have been kind of rebranded in recent years as psychoplastogens. They induce this state in yourself where you can consider it like a more supple state. I like the way of describing it like that. The ability for the brain to become more malleable and things, right? New connections, synapses. And within that, also this enhanced entropic state. And that doesn't necessarily, as I think Stuart said yesterday, it doesn't necessarily mean that that's more disordered, but there's a greater level of uncertainty injected into the system of the brain. And that in and of itself is simultaneously a key source of transdiagnostic therapeutic potential, right? Because it's not just like an SSRI, you're targeting a particular neurotransmitter system, increasing serotonin, etc. But in this case, you are doing that. It's just one specific serotonin receptor, but it has very global, profound downstream effects on the whole brain, and increasing its plasticity and entropy and things. But that's also going to be really foundational for why there are challenging experiences as well. And why that is kind of paradox is because of these structures normally supporting stable cognitive constructs being both pathogenic if they're too rigid, where that kind of plasticity will be salutary, healthy for you, but also necessary for healthy psychological function, right? And therefore they're going to be pathological if they're too flexible, and then that plasticity becomes more of a threat. And this can be related to this idea of criticality in the brain, where our brain is kind of considered to be poised at this perfect state of criticality. But if it's subcritical, then it's going to be not flexible enough and be related to certain conditions and things. But if it's supercritical, for instance, it can be too flexible, and that may be where some of these people having these enduring psychedelic challenges may be landing. So let's look at some of the actual qualitative data that came out of this navigating groundlessness study. I wish obviously I could talk all about it, because that's where the richness really is, but I've only selected a few of these categories that came out of that thematic analysis. So this one was referred to as existential concern, right? So overall we had 26 participants, and 16 of those recounted experiences consistent with this. So this first sort of sub-theme really was about experiences of death, okay? And 9 people reported this. So this particular participant said that she suddenly conceived of her being so at peace with the idea of death, and that she felt it as disturbing, ultimately. So dying sounds really freeing. I was looking out to the ocean, almost imagining my funeral, what it would be like to sort of return as energy into the universe. In one way, that was really beautiful, but it really scared me, because I was like, oh, that is actually frightening, because I don't want to die. It was the it doesn't matter part that really rattled me. So I chose that because I thought it nicely encapsulated the tricks that your brain can play on you in these kinds of scenarios. So another one under the same idea of existential concern was about the sense of meaninglessness or emptiness, and 5 people reported that. And one of these, more like rich and powerful quotes was as follows. So I was occupying something like unity consciousness that no longer had a connection to a sense of self. So, she went on to describe this kind of more classical, like mystical type unitive sort of state. But I did not experience this loss of sense of self as a positive thing. This was not an experience of divine expansiveness as I became one with life, nor was this an overwhelming presence of love or divinity. This was an experience of pure fear, of a feeling of being cut away from everything. Instead of finding something loving and divine or sacred, I found the polar opposite. I found separation and loneliness and meaninglessness and despair and entrapment. I won't go on for fear of pranging myself out. Another category here, exceptional human experiences. So, a whole manner of things such as out-body experiences, near-death experiences, a sense of like psi and things like that. And so 17 people described that, but this particular sub-theme is this idea of experiences of the afterlife, but in very kind of uncomfortable, adverse ways, and 6 people described that. So this particular person took changa, so that's basically where sort of sometimes described as like smokable ayahuasca. It's like DMT, but it's mixed with certain herbs that you smoke. And they railed against a bizarre solipsistic manifestation of kind of accomplishing of salvation. So they described, I was in heaven, dark was like choirs and shit, and like theater lights you'd have on a mirror backstage. And then this slot machine with all these ding, 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 like slot machine winning sounds, whatever they sound like. And when you win the thing, it was like, I'd won the game. I'd done everything that needed to be done. My life choices have been the right ones in this particular goal of the game. This sense of like, we've raised the human consciousness, we just fixed all the shit. It was like I was talking to God. And then she responded, I was like, but it can't be over. What about my goddaughter? What about her christening that she was going to go to soon? And then this communicator, this being, just said, it was like your goddaughter never existed. None of it ever existed. So continuing on with this particular participant, she continued to describe something more consistent with like a near-death experience, but of a very distressing kind of nature. And that's kind of interesting just at the outset, because I published a paper last year about how changa experiences can actually be very replicating in certain ways of near-death experiences. But also, there is quite a bit of literature about distressing near-death experiences. It's not all just love and light, as a lot of people tend to think. It's about 14% at least of these kind of distressing NDEs. So again, she went on to say it was all just part of the game. All these people, like your mom and your dad and everyone, telling me it was just a game and it was all over. But somehow she'd won. And so that's interesting because Nancy Evans Bush, she published a book called Dancing Past the Dark, and that was about her own very, very, very distressing near-death experiences, but very the same ultimately as what you just heard from that changa participant about some kind of entity saying that her life was just a dream, she's just a dream, she doesn't exist, no one ever existed, and that. And so there was a more recent study of challenging near-death experiences as well, and it was just interesting how all of the main categories were the same, were consistent between that recent one and the more early study of distressing NDEs by Bush and Grayson, and that included the sense of like void-like near-death experiences, some of which, it's not just these 2 isolated cases, some of which is about this, it's solipsistic, but it's kind of manifesting in this maybe more dualistic manner of like some kind of communication about nothing existing but that individual, it seems, in that particular moment. So, and just also weirdly, we also had a DMT participant in our field study that I carried out as part of my PhD. He was like a matrix kind of scenario, and again, this communicator saying to him that, in the kind of way, like saying, think of your mother, and he thought of his mother, and was like, well, she doesn't exist, and then like sort of like saw a manifestation of them just vanishing into existence, and like in a serial kind of manner with every single loved one that they ever had. So that was pretty depressing. But just interesting in terms of the parallelity, the correspondences there. So again, she continued, but what was inspiring here, and again, I wish I could actually expand more on the inspiring nature of what came out at the end of this particular paper, not just these really deep challenges that people had, but how they navigated them, how they integrated them, and where they came to in their life after the fact. So she says, integration is my life's work. My life is a walking integration, even my children, because I had to like battle to have them from whoever, this entity, and they feel like a gift. So, that's not only interesting because in NDEs more traditionally, people might come back because of their children, or they're reminded of their children or something. And in this case, whoever they met there was saying the antithesis. It's like, you don't even have any children. So I think this is testament to the post-traumatic growth of these individuals, where this person could have quite easily descended into a kind of spiral of trauma. But instead of believing whatever she was communicated, maybe this sense of discernment, but also I think was testament to this kind of creative plasticity and this paradoxical plasticity, which might underlie these challenging experiences in some way, but also allows for this creativity of this individual to really fundamentally reframe it, where her children, because she fought for them and she believed that they were real, they were actually a gift to her. So it was through that experience that she was able to perceive her children as a gift, and that was like a fundamental healing for her in her process afterward. How am I doing for time? About 4 minutes? 5 minutes? Amazing, thank you. So just thinking maybe now about the neuroscience kind of component of things, in a more general way, what might be the relevant things in the neurosciences of psychedelics to think about when it comes to challenging experiences. So, your models of the world basically they're probabilistically encoded in your priors, right? Your beliefs and your expectations about the world, and they support a sense of certainty about the world. And so psychedelics dismantle these. They not to get into the computational neuroscience of things, but they undermine them and loosen them, they change their weighting, so that ultimately can then manifest in this sense of groundlessness, in this kind of sense of existential crisis, because you no longer have certainty about what you once considered just implicit, tacit assumptions about the world. At that level, when that becomes undermined, this is where a lot of these people can feel this sense of groundlessness. Also, the heightening of cortical entropy, as I mentioned before, but there's a sense of this idea of pivotal mental states, which is this idea of in that psychedelic state, your brain is very, very sensitive to both extrinsic but also intrinsic perturbations, right? So that something that happens outside, a thought or whatever, can bifurcate in terms of the kind of valence of your experience, right? It can go one way or the other. It can go down the kind of path of hell, or it can ascend to the heavens. And also, if the actual content of the experience that's unfolding for you in the psychedelic state is itself especially novel, right? It's not just this like loosening or disappearing of the world, but it's a kind of whole new world that you didn't know was possible. Suddenly, you're encountered with, like these experiences I just described for you before. That is going to have considerable ontological implications on top of that, right? So that's a further challenge for integration. There's also this kind of analogy of a neural annealing. So this analogy from metallurgy, where the heating of the metals to change its constituent state, so it's more malleable and you can work with it, and then it cools to another state and things and shape. So that's kind of maybe similar to what's happening in the brain with psychedelics, is that the neurons become more readily excitable. And the kind of threshold is lowered, and then in a more uniform way, and so that can lead to more ease of activity, and that's the playing field for plasticity to occur. And so, but when that's happening, and you're having a kind of simultaneous, really challenging psychedelic experience, that's basically so there's a feedback effect onto this ground state of this newly annealed brain, so your brain is very easily changed in that same state where you're concurrently having this very challenging psychedelic experience and can ingrain basically into your synaptic pathways. And that, I think, is one of the more important things to think about when it comes to the enduring challenges, not just in the acute state, but in an enduring way. And that is why in this post-acute period, which has been considered a while ago as the window of plasticity, that's really going to be critical for kind of course correction, right? And obviously that's the same with any kind of psychedelic experience. The plastic integration phase afterward is going to be really crucial, but especially for these challenging experiences, it's that window afterward where that's going to be your best opportunity to rework what had happened. But maybe it's a bit more specifically in terms of what these experiences I mentioned before, this person having this increased fear of death. So there, some arguments saying that your priors in your brain, some of them are going to be really crucial for repressing the sense of what might be otherwise like the spontaneous death anxiety. And if you're suddenly just going to dismantle those, then that, for some, that could quite easily lead to a greater confrontation and therefore anxiety over their mortality. And in terms of the existential experiences and the exceptional human experiences, the mystical type experience that I described and the near-death experience I described, but of a negative kind of valence, that could be also related to the sense of this idea of avalanching as another analogy in the psychedelic neurosciences, where in an avalanche there's this build-up of pressure and then suddenly there's a critical threshold which is reached and there's massive deluge of ice, whatever, falls, and it's kind of similar to the brain. A critical threshold of activity is reached, and then there's a kind of exponential branching of neuronal activity, and that could, sort of similar to the pivotal mental state thing I mentioned, that can lead to this kind of crescendoing of maximal intensity of whatever valence it may be. Also, the unitive state. So I didn't actually specifically mention this, but the mystical experience would have included that. So you could think of the brain as like an energy landscape, and if you have different networks, for instance, like the default mode network or the task positive network, they're anti-correlated, right? In the kind of states that we're currently in. But in the psychedelic state, they become more correlated, basically. So there's less differentiation, they become more uniform, and that is going to be one important correlate of the mystical state, but also this loss of the world model, as I mentioned before. So it's as far as your brain is concerned, if the world model that you have has just been flattened, that's the only access to any world that you have. So as far as you're concerned, there is no universe. Existential OCD is a particular contribution of mine to that paper, where basically people have just continuing intrusive kind of thoughts about these questions, about what's the meaning of life, why am I here, what happens after death and things of that nature. And this is basically what a lot, in a way, most actually of our participants described in some way or another. And that's not unsurprising because these are metaphysical type experiences, really, that you're having under psychedelic states. And so if you're in this more plastic state at the time and you're suddenly being opened up to these kind of questions you wouldn't have confronted as powerfully before, then under this kind of this neural annealing, as I mentioned before, it will ingrain. So it might be this kind of paradoxical thing where you have a broader, your mind and brain have been kind of opened up, right? But there may be like selective kind of wells or tractor basins in the computational kind of way of thinking of things related to these specific existential thoughts. So this is just the last slide, really. One thought that just stimulated this, my wanting to give this talk generally is just that if you were to take away, perfect the kind of set and setting, and control everything in that kind of way, and eliminate the psychological predictors through screening or whatever, some will still actually just experience these types of challenging states, and maybe in an enduring way. And I think that's why the neural correlates and maybe the genetic correlates and things of that nature are going to be really important in those examples. And yeah, I mean, so there are neural correlates of the acute state, but also the predictors. Why would we think of needing to look at specific neural predictors if we already have many psychological predictors? And then you can just look at the neural correlates of those psychological predictors. Yeah, I mean, certainly you could. But I don't know, Maria should be here. I think she's talking just afterward, because she was the one that told me this. I told it to Jules Evans, who does the whole challenging psychedelic project, and he didn't really care. But one specific context which would be really important for this is is the application of psychedelics to people in coma, because that's been happening in the University of Liège, for instance. They gave them ketamine, but they've also been trying to do other psychedelics, but there may be ethical problems there. And I actually endorsed their administration of these for that particular context and indication, but with many, many caveats, because obviously that can be a very difficult scenario potentially if you're kind of spiking these individuals. You only have the consent of next of kin and things. So in that case, you can't give them psychological predictors or whatever. But you can, if you do have the neural predictors, then you can see who's going to benefit most from these experiences. Yeah, I already mentioned about neural annealing being important for the enduring challenges. But just the very last thing I'd like to say is just that if maybe people, it's not going to be the ideal thing to fixate on neural predictors so that people are just going to have perfect experiences and never have any troubles afterward, obviously, because that is part of this whole dark night of the soul in the process, such that many of these people, like I said, in the more inspiring reports that we had, they said that they would have this experience all over again just because of what they learned, right? And Jamie Will nicely put that in the Breaking Convention conference before in April this year, saying that that's really why we use psychedelics. It's because they're dangerous, even in a clinical context, but obviously we just need to do everything we can in order to do that in the most responsible kind of way. It's just some future indications, but yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, Pascal. We do not have time right now for questions, but it is extremely likely that we will have time for discussion after the next two presenters, because I don't think the final presenter is here. So hang around for any question, and I have a discussion and question for Pascal, for example, but we'll wait till the end. So the next presentation is by June Russell.
Oh, hang on, give me one moment. Oh, how do I do this? Entire screen, start mirroring, great. There we go. Hi everyone, my name is June Russell. I'm a blogger. I write for the blog smoothbrains.net, where I primarily write about topics of phenomenology, psychedelics, sort of unusual aspects of neuroscience, various mental curiosities, that kind of thing. Something I do is I collaborate a lot with the organization, the Qualia Research Institute, who are they're a non-profit who are devoted to finding ways to mathematically model consciousness. Ideally, with the one goal would be finding ways of demonstrating which theory of consciousness is viable. They generally work with a physicalist ontology, so they're mostly interested in primarily EM field theories of consciousness, but they're pretty good about being agnostic towards quantum theories of consciousness. Definitely come up a whole lot in our discussions. And one thing we did last year, or they did, I attended, was they put on a couple of psychedelic retreats both in Brazil and then in Canada, where they assembled a number of interesting creatives from all over the world, scientists and computer programmers, to basically experiment with first ayahuasca and then 5-MeO-DMT in order to perhaps observe interesting phenomenological states that could indicate towards a given theory of consciousness. And so if you're interested in their work, you can check out heart.curi.org or curi.org for their main website. But the title of this post is Hypercomputation Without Bothering the Cactus People, Software Development for the DMT Headspace. Now, the title is a joke. I'm not going to take any specific stances towards hypercomputation, but there is a blog post by the psychologist Scott Alexander called Universal Love, Said the Cactus Person, which starts with a rather interesting story in which a, I guess, budding psychonaut enters the DMT headspace in order to ask a couple of DMT entities whether they would kindly factorize some large prime numbers for him. To what end? I guess the post gets into it. Perhaps it's to demonstrate the reality of DMT or demonstrate interesting computational phenomena. But if you actually check out the post, this is inspired by an actual paper called A Methodology for Studying Various Interpretations of the N,N-Dimethyltryptamine-Induced Alternate Reality by Marco Rodriguez, which basically proposes an equivalent experiment. It's just Scott wrote a sort of amusing short story based on it. Now, in, I think it was 2022, 2023, I visited the San Francisco Bay Area for the first time, where I met Andres Gomez-Emelson, who is the director of the Qualia Research Institute. Basically hung out to discuss some of his blog posts. Now, he has a very interesting blog called qualiacomputing.com. On there, there's a very long post called The Universal Plot, Part 1, Consciousness versus Pure Replicators, in which professes a number of philosophical stances, one of which is that the reason we're conscious at all is because evolution has essentially recruited consciousness to perform, I guess, some kind of computational task on its behalf. Evidently, there's some kind of computational speed up involved in recruiting EM field states or quantum mechanical states. So I said to him, look, how do we test this? Is there asking DMT entities about this seems silly, but is there a way we could construct a stimulus which demonstrates the, I guess, computational advantages afforded by consciousness? And so I set a very strong intention to figure out how to do so. I guess my starting point is the inverse optics problem. Now, the inverse optics problem basically says, look, we experience two flat images, one from each eye, and somehow the brain merges those two, performs binocular fusion into one, I guess, 2.5 dimensional image, or I guess an image plus a depth map. It does this very fast, does this approximately 40 times a second, and it can do it even in the presence of totally unfamiliar stimuli which it's not trained upon, without, you could probably make good arguments for, I guess, artificial intelligence being able to solve a magic eye problem, but the fact that we can do it even though we don't know what image we're looking for, or we can do it and recognize completely abstract depth maps, seems like a clue that this is a very generalizable, I guess, computational task that our visual cortex is solving all day long. So this here is the Necker cube. This is an example of what we would call a bistable stimuli, or a stimulus. Did you ever draw one of these on your books at school? I know a lot of my friends used to draw this kind of thing. The cool thing about it is you can flip it with your mind, you can stare at it, and you can kind of do a weird mental move thing, and suddenly it goes forward, and then it goes backwards, or it goes up and then it goes down. It's a bit ambiguous. There was a period of my life when I guess as you do, this only lasted about a month, but I had ready access to DMT, and I found myself using a DMT pen to basically stare at interesting visual stimuli on my computer screen. And what I noticed was fairly reliable, and I have a number of friends who would verify this. A modest dose of DMT, I can stare at something like this and it will kind of pop out of the screen, almost as if that which is, whatever process is normally suppressing the formation of a depth map when I look at this on a flat computer screen, or you look at it on the projector screen, it's like it's having some constraints removed. Like you can kind of sense that it wants to go 3D, perhaps, when you stare at it now. DMT lets it just kind of do that. And so I explored a number of other stimuli. This is a good one. This is a very multimodal stimuli under the influence of DMT. This is an optical illusion by, I think, Professor Kitaoka, Professor Akiyoshi Kitaoka, and perhaps you can get a sense of how it wants to form a sort of pyramidal shape. Well, I noticed as I increased the amount of DMT I had, it's like the visual field approached a state of criticality in which it was able to flicker through a large number of different discretized depth map interpretations very, very rapidly. Like I could very easily sort of turn the pyramid inside out, or I could get this funny checkerboard thing, or even as I ramped the dosage up things would start to go haywire past a certain threshold, but there's very much a sweet spot during which very interesting set of configurations could be explored. And so that was about as far as I got during that time period. I sort of background intention to, I guess, research or pursue a line of research that could help out with this process. And probably the first paper I read was a paper by Scott Aaronson, who's a quantum physicist. I think he's a quantum computing guy. I'm not actually sure what his precise background is. But here's a paper called NP-complete Problems of Physical Reality, which explores a number of times over the years when people have tried to use physical systems to solve computational problems of a particular computational class. It might be beyond the scope to explain exactly what an NP-complete or an NP-hard problem is, but suffice it to say it's the kind of problem that normally takes a long period of time to find a solution for when you calculate it the classical way, but potentially if you use something like soap bubbles or protein folding or quantum computing, various people have suggested over the years that maybe you could get some kind of computational speed up that would solve one of these problems faster. And one example mentioned in there is soap bubbles. So Scott actually tried this. There's a particular kind of one of these problems. I can't remember whether this one's a NP-hard or NP-complete one, but you see the dots there. The lines between the dots form what is known as a Steiner tree, and figuring out what, I forget the exact thing, but it's following some kind of energy minimization function, and calculating what that Steiner tree is one of the, that's one of these computationally hard problems. And the test was whether you could actually build an apparatus that would solve these using soap bubbles. And so he did, and it didn't work. It got stuck on local minima. So here we are. Not very encouraging, but I kept reading. Eventually someone sent me a great paper called Harnessing Vision for Computation by Mark Chang-Zi. Now this was a guy who actually was proposing visual illusions that performed a computational task. And you can see how you can start with these cubes here, which are shaded, to bias them to either go this way or that way, just like the Necker cube I showed earlier, and trace the path around while keeping the particular orientation congruent with the cube up here. And this actually forms an XOR gate, which you can theoretically build any CPU out of, I think. Is it XOR gates or NAND gates or what have you? Now this is terrifically unwieldy. I can stare at this and I can trace it around with my eyes all day long, and it sort of isn't stable enough to work. And what I figured was maybe under the influence of DMT, it might actually be a lot more stable, given DMT actually gives you a three-dimensional depth map. And it still doesn't work because I couldn't fit enough of it into my foveal region. My fovea, I would sort of zoom out and it wasn't as strong. I'd zoom in, move it closer, make the image bigger. Didn't work. It's too unwieldy. So I kept thinking about the problem. I thought, okay, maybe there's a way of coupling together these bistable stimuli such that you could build a lattice or something out of them, so you do get this massively multi-stable stimuli, but you solve a different computational problem to this sort of node and wire thing. Now, a good candidate is something called an Ising machine. Again, it might be beyond the scope here to get into exactly what an Ising machine is. Ising machine is a bit like a lattice with spins that can go up and down, and you might have spins that want to anti-couple to one another. This one wants to go down, that one wants to go up, and so on for all of its neighbors. Now, you might also have lattices which so this is an arresting ground state. This is happy. This is non-frustrated, because everything gets to couple to its neighbors in the preferred way. Whereas if you try to do the same thing on a triangular lattice, you're going to wind up with what is known as geometric frustration, in which, can you imagine the arrow here doesn't know whether to go up or down based on its neighbors, because it has two neighbors which are in opposition to one another. So figuring out, I think it was figuring out what the ground state of something like that was. It's been a while since I read about this stuff, and I'm not an academic, so I'm sort of winging a lot of this stuff. A lot of this is based on like Wikipedia deep dive material. Suffice to say, this is something I think it's like finding the ground state of something like that is one of these NP hard or NP complete problems. Anyhow, you can use an Ising machine. Oh no, this was it. You can use an Ising machine to solve an NP hard problem called a graph cut problem by building an Ising machine and setting up some of its nodes such that they're incongruous with one another, and then like the division between the two forms the like output of the computation. This might be a bit too much. I'm running out of time, so I'm going to skip forward to the actual stimulus a bit. So I spent a bunch of time trying to come up with something. This is the kind of thing I would potter away on in the evenings from time to time over a period of about a couple of years or so. Just something I'd return to every like three months or so. Till eventually I actually stayed here in Barcelona last year, and I was staying with a friend in his apartment in Elborn. Went out for a wander. I was hoping to find I guess like a souvenir of some kind to take back home when I left, and we ran across a magic shop. So I bought a deck of tarot cards from the magic shop, and we walked home through the sort of this big structure in Elborn that encompasses these Roman ruins that are there, and I think we unboxed the tarot deck, and like the first thing that happened was the emperor fell out. My friend was like, oh, it obviously works, it represents the Roman emperor. Oh, whoa, trivia dude. And when I got home, I realized there's a pattern on the back of the tarot cards which had these kind of stimuli that can go one way or go the other. And I got very stoked, and I sat down, I wrote a web shader, and here we are, there's a web app which does the thing. And so I'm going to have to exit out of here and go to the actual software. So this is a 32-bit qualia computer. And what you can do is you can make any one of these go forwards, or you can right-click it to go backwards. And you'll see it tiles. So insofar as these form a lattice, the lattice sort of loops back on itself after a certain period. So it gets to basically wrap back around. My intuition was that this would be a lot more stable under DMT because DMT loves reifying tiling patterns. Whereas the issue before was that you had a non-repeating pattern that was too large to fit in the fovea. This would let me scan it with my fovea and build up a stable image. And so you can clip these together. And you see those two are frustrated because they're both, the shading, they're both sort of trying to come out. Or they're trying to go in, actually, now that I look at the projection. Whereas we can make, if we make this one go out and that one go in, then they are satisfied. And so we can allow this to propagate. And the way I imagined it would work is that if I stared at this on DMT, then it would actually turn 3D, but all the flat neighbors to every one of these would also want to go 3D until you basically have the whole lattice going in a particular direction. Whereas what you can also do is if you set some going one way and some going the other way, then you, so I've got an overlay which lets you cheat, so you can see some are red and some are blue, and that indicates one chirality versus another chirality. If I then hit solve, which is what I imagine would happen on DMT, I'm optimistic here, I don't know any of this yet, I'm just playing around, you get a solution, and it's the shape of this particular boundary between these two incongruent regions forms the actual output of your computation. This is known as a sparse cut problem. Now, this is only a proof of concept, and as you can see, like, I've written a sparse cut solver, you know, it solves the thing as soon as I click the button. So if I reset everything and I pick some sort of random configuration, like, I don't know, that, then I hit solve, then it does it pretty much instantly. So this is not like a proof of consciousness doing anything faster than a computer, because the computer can already run the like 96 odd lines of JavaScript a lot faster. So it's a proof of concept at best. And I kind of just wrote this whole thing just to get people thinking about the computational properties of consciousness, because it didn't seem to be a thing that was on people's radar. Now, it's I just want to demonstrate a few features. Like, you can actually play around with a lot of the, you know, you can tweak a lot of the effects and scale it and, you know, change the color saturation and stuff. But I published this thing. I hadn't tried it. And within like just a few days, I got a message from someone who said, someone who will remain anonymous, who said like 2 of their anonymous friends had tried it. Apparently it was deeply unpleasant. And some of the quotes are like, I said to them, oh my God, I heard the computer did not want to like treat its users nicely. I'm sorry to hear this. P1 said, no, it did not. I felt strong resistance. P2, it was strangely bad. The cactus person does not want to factor the fucking number. It really, really doesn't want to. I said, hang on, they continued, not sure how to explain it, but the pattern propagated like a virus. I said, oh no. Yeah, it felt like my brain segfaulted, and it felt like painful mentally for it to propagate. I said, oh my God, I'm so sorry. They're like, it's all good. I've purposely given myself bad trips much worse than this. It was definitely type 2 enjoyable. And the other person said, yeah, I'm glad I tried it. So it didn't hurt anyone. I was quite glad to hear that, but I was forced to confront the idea that I might have actually built the first computing system that runs on suffering. The joke I normally tell is like, oh, I couldn't do worse than JavaScript, but here we are. So I actually did sit down with a meditator friend. Here's some notes I took during that session, someone I know and trust as like a advanced meditator who can deal with extraordinary amounts of, like, he's got really strong equanimity, so he can deal with just about any bizarre state. And he was able to analyze, like, he described it as a sensation of torsion he felt in the frustrated region between the 2 shaded regions. And I'm like, wow, that actually kind of checks out. So I have played around with it myself. Here were some notes I sent to some friends during that session. I couldn't actually get it to work. I didn't get the depth map. I saw a superposition of a zillion different depth maps. So I might be doing something wrong, or my mental map is incorrect. But as far as I'm concerned, it's sort of back to the drawing board at this stage, though I would like the opportunity to actually test it properly in a controlled environment. And like, yeah, like one really important point that a friend made is that like the output of that computation, it's equivalent to a 32-bit number. It's 32 ones and zeros. For a human to actually communicate that, like there's a bottleneck that's going to be much, much slower than the actual computation itself happening in the visual field. So it may not even be the case that this provides a meaningful demonstration to, I guess, an external observer. It may only be able to convince the actual subject of this, so that's what's going on. So in the future, I'm quite interested in continuing to investigate what computations I think the visual field is actually doing, because I think in this case we're doing, essentially building a very cumbersome CPU on top of a GPU, or I guess like GPU on top of a qualia computer, quantum computer, EM field computer, whatever it may be. My current suspicion is that it's doing something a little bit like an optical Fourier transform a lot of the time. And yeah, I intend to continue that line of research, and optimistically maybe we can develop a, I guess, sort of stimuli that works sober, and we can make meaningful statements about the computational requirements required to, say, solve a depth map in that state. Yeah, so that's a fractional Fourier transform. That's what that optical system is effectively doing all the time. I'm afraid that's quite a compressed video, but I don't know, just some hints towards where I'm thinking at the moment. I know I'm running out of time. Yeah, that's me. Any questions?
There are times for 1 or 2 questions, so let me come to this side, since anybody? Okay, yes.
I know it's kind of been in the news a bit lately, but did you try any of the things with the laser stuff as well that people have been reporting?
I actually have done the thing with the laser. It didn't work. I've got some quite detailed write-ups about that online. Yeah, me and a number of collaborators basically report that what we saw when we zoned into the kind of laser speckle pattern, an interesting aspect of the laser speckle pattern is it looks like it's actually happening behind the wall, which seems to be like one important thing that sees the weird visuals, as well as like it's speckly and it sort of like changes quite a bit as you bob your head around. I saw something like Chladni plate patterns. And I can totally imagine how those, if you like zoned into them and reified them in the right way, would actually turn into something similar to human writing systems. So of course, like human writing systems have already like been subject to a lot of evolutionary pressure towards being very, very simple and simplified and actually quite similar to things like Chladni patterns. Well, I mean, you look at like Roman script, you know, with serifs and so forth. Those are all like, I think those are like catenary curves, but I've seen fonts, like Chinese fonts that look very much like Chladni plate patterns. They're super, super simplified and reified. So that's what we saw. I don't think there's anything going on with the laser experiment.
Thank you. Thank you. And for the final paper of the session, and we will have time for questions and discussions, it's not an altered identity state, it's rather that Aurélie Sori-Frisch is going to present instead of Eleni Kroupi.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for staying so long. This will be a bit of a shift of a topic. So we are very much interested on the usage of EEG and of psychedelics for clinical applications. And basically, I would like to present you our work, which was done mainly by Eleni Kroupi. She couldn't be here today because of a medical event. So I will try to go through the presentation of the work that we have done together. As you might know, so microdosing has been proposed to improve mental health conditions. But there is a very large inter-subject variability on the results of this microdosing, and there is some hypothesis that this depends on the cognitive state at baseline. So the measurement of this cognitive state might be complex or costly in terms of time, and therefore what we propose is to use EEG measurement at baseline in order to optimize these clinical trials with microdosing in psychedelics. And that's the mainly motivation of the talk today. And here what we are doing is analyzing a data set of microdosing that was acquired at the University of Maastricht. And we are applying on it 3 different complexity measures. You might be wondering why complexity measures. This is basically because it has been observed in psychedelics an increase of these complexity measures, and it has been observed as well an increase of plasticity in some studies, and therefore we wanted to use these complexity measures to characterize this cognitive state at baseline and the results of the microdosing application. And then, so what we are trying to do is basically measuring EEG at baseline and looking at changes during the microdose and see if there is any type of relationship between them. As I was commenting, we are using a data set that was acquired and generated and designed and developed by the University of Maastricht by Kim Kuipers and Jan Ramakers. Basically, it is a between subject study where we have 4 different weeks. Where the subjects take either, it's a randomized controlled trial, so of an active condition of a microdose of 15 micrograms of LSD, which were taken in 4 doses twice a week. And where we have EEG at baseline in the week before, after the first dose and after the fourth dose, and then at the follow-up as well. So we are analyzing these 4 points in this particular study. What has been observed, as you might know, so in previous studies with psychedelics and complexity measured on EEG signals, is that there is an increase of impulsive complexity. This is the measure that it's mostly used in studies of psychedelics. And this increase of complexity has been observed in different substances, psilocybin, ketamine, LSD, but also in DMT. And mostly this increase of complexity has been observed on the posterior parts of the brain, while ketamine, you can observe it overall. So what we have done is taken this EEG data set and applied these 3 different complexity measures. Why these 3 different complexity measures? There are different complexity measures and all are expected to measure different aspects of complexity in the signals, which I will explain a bit as I go through the different measures. And then particularly we are using these complexity measures to demonstrate the effect of the active condition of the microdose LSD, but also to analyze the relationship between the LSD response in terms of brain activity with respect to the activity at baseline. And our main hypotheses are basically that we will find no differences at baseline. This is important because it means both groups, the active and the placebo conditions, are balanced in terms of their complexity in their brain signals. We will find an effect of the LSD microdoses, especially on the active dose ingestion. It can be also at follow-up, as shown in microdoses LSD. And also we are measuring the relationship between the activity, the complexity at baseline, and the change in the complexity during the LSD microdose. And we expect this, so those that have larger complexity at baseline to have larger changes. So those that have larger complexity at baseline will have a larger effect as measured by the EEG complexity in the microdose. As you might know, EEG are electrical signals, so we are applying the regular processing of EEG, which includes basically applying some filtering. This could be the broadband between 1 and 45 hertz. We interpolate by channels, the common average reference. We remove ICA, so we use ICA to remove 5 artifacts. This is important because we are analyzing as well power in the gamma band. And we use some additional thresholds to reject artifacts in the signals. And then, so as you will see, we have applied 2 different types of analysis. One, measuring the complexity in this broadband from 1 to 45 hertz, but also measuring the complexity in the typical narrow band, so starting from delta, theta, alpha, beta, and gamma. So for this, we have applied an additional filter here, and then we take the signal and apply the complexity measures. After removing the artifacts, this is what we observed. So this is the power spectral density and grand average. So you can see here the alpha peak. So here we have some channels that might not be so typical, but if you analyze the number of clean channels per subject, we have all subjects both in the active condition as well as in the placebo condition, so have all channels clean, so we can work with them so without any problems. So we have applied, as I was commenting, the Higuchi fractal dimension. This is a particular type of complexity measure that measures the multi-scale self-similarity of the signal. So basically, if it's analyzed at different scales, the signal is self-similar. And when applying it to broadband, we find out what we were expecting, so an increase of, so here we apply an ANOVA for the interaction between the session and the condition, and then a post-hoc analysis to compare in each of the particular sessions. And we found out significant interaction with the ANOVA, and then looking at the doses, one at session the first day, and at the fourth day we find out also an increase, a significant increase in complexity as measured by the Higuchi fractal dimension. And this appears to be as well located in the expected areas, so in the posterior areas. This is the measure by channels, while we are showing here the average overall channels. When analyzing, one important aspect is that with this particular measure, we don't find out any differences at 1 week follow-up. And you will see why I'm saying that. So when you analyze these narrow bands, specifically in the delta band, you find out a significant decrease of the complexity in the delta band. This has been already observed with microdose LSD in these two papers, Murray 2022, in this paper, but measured with LZW. So we are finding here something that it's already reported in the literature already with, although we are measuring with another metric. We don't find any significant effect in the alpha and the complexity of the alpha band, but a significant increase in the complexity in the beta band. This appears as well in the posterior parts of the cortex, and this has been already reported as well, not with microdoses LSD, but with full doses. And in gamma, we don't find any interaction between session and condition. This is what I was commenting before, so we would like to know what is the relationship between the complexity measure at baseline with the change. And this is for the first active doses, and this for the fourth active doses, and we find out a significant linear relationship between the complexity at baseline with the change. So it's basically what we were expecting. So if you have a higher complexity, you will experience a higher effect in terms of this complexity. And this relationship is linear, significantly linear. We find the same effect just in one of the sessions, in the first session in the delta band, but not in the beta band. That was the other banding we have found significant complexity differences between the active and the placebo conditions. We are analyzing as well the signals with LZW. LZW is a measure, a complexity measure that measures comprehensibility. So basically, how predictable is your signal? It's related with signal regularity. It's a different type of complexity, but even though we find out also a significant increase, so a significant interaction between session and condition, but also a significant increase in the broadband in the doses in the day 1 of the doses and in the day 4th. And again, no differences at follow-up. This is important in the sense that With a similar study, but with microdoses of LSD, you find out effects in the complexity of the brain signals after 1 week follow-up, what you don't find out, that we don't find out here. It might be that the doses are different, so we are about to analyze more concretely the results. Analyzing the narrow band, so we find out a significant increase in alpha and in beta. Both have been reported in the literature. What is interesting is that we found the increase in alpha more in the central areas. This is interesting, worth taking a look. With this particular measure, we find out also in the broadband a linear relationship between the LZW at baseline and the change in LZW, both in the session 1 as well as in the day 4. This linear relationship is significant in both cases. So we have applied a third measure of complexity, which is this permutation entropy. This permutation entropy is a particular measure that measures complexity related to stochastic dynamics. So with the statistical characteristics of the signal. Again, we have found out in the broadband significant interaction between the session and the condition, with an increase of complexity in day 1 and day 4. Again, no significant change of these 15 microgram doses in the 1 week follow-up. Again, so the changes are most prominent in the posterior part of the brain. Here we find again, as before, this decrease in the complexity in the delta band, that it's highly significant. This is similar, as I was commenting, as the results reported in Murray et al. In 2022. And we find out also differences, significant increase in the complexity in the alpha band, but only in the first session. Here, these are the most strange results since it has not been reported in the literature. So we find out a significant decrease in the beta band. So with this particular measure of permutation entropy in the day 1 and the day 4. Again, no changes after follow-up. And this is worth further taking a look, also because the effect of the interaction is highly significant, as you can see here. After analyzing this linear relationship, we have found only this linear relationship to be significant in the gamma band. So permutation entropy at baseline is linearly related to the change in permutation entropy only for the permutation entropy as extracted in the gamma band. And so far are the findings of analyzing this interesting data set. And I can report to you a summary of the work. Neuroplasticity has been reported after usage of psychedelics, even measured by this particular marker called BDNF. Also, the usage of psychedelics, or after the usage of psychedelic, an increase of EEG complexity has been reported in several papers. Both with full doses, but also in microdoses, as in Murray 2022. So here, basically, we are trying to use EEG complexity as a proxy of plasticity. And that's the reason for using these different types of measures. Even in the literature, the most usual one has been this Lempel-Shift complexity. There are several works. I mentioned here 3 of them, but it's the measure that it's most widely used in psychedelic research. But this kind of complexity measures only data compression or regularity, as I was commenting before, while there are other measures that measure other aspects of complexity that are related, that are characterizing this complexity of the signals, like the Higuchi fractal dimension, which quantifies this multi-scale self-similarity in the signal. On the other hand, so we have this permutation entropy, which is more related to statistical characteristics of predictability in the signal, for which we have used this permutation entropy. And you can find some more insights on the difference between these different complexity measures in this particular paper, Mateos et al. 2020. We have observed an increase in the levels of complexity under the active condition of microdose LSD. We have observed them so in broadband, but also in several typical narrow bands, except for the delta, where we have observed this decrease that has been already reported in the literature, so this decrease in delta complexity, and outstanding, so decrease also of complexity as measured with permutation entropy in the beta band. You can see that the analysis of the broadband with the different complexity metrics are generally aligned. So the difference show mostly when analyzing the narrow bands. And one thing that we are trying to show is this relationship between the baseline complexity with the changes that are provoked by the microdoses. So the idea is that you can use EEG measures at baseline to optimize your clinical trials, both with full doses, psychedelics, as well as with microdoses. And this would be the future work that we are undertaking, so to see whether we can use these baseline measures to predict the response of the active conditions, and also to predict the response in the blinding condition, which is one of the reasons why microdoses are being used. And with this, I would like to end by thanking Eleni Kroupi, who was doing the computational part of the work, as well as our collaborators at the Maastricht University, Kim Kuipers and Jan Ramagers, that were providing this data set for us to analyze. And I would like to thank you for your attention, for staying so long. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. Thank you.
We have time specifically for questions for him, and then while he's answering, I would like to invite the other speakers to sit down here, and we'll have a discussion. We can have 15, 20 minutes, but we have time for questions specifically for his paper now. There's one there.
So what do the measures of neural signal complexity relate to in the brain action? Do you have any hypothesis, like permutation entropy, etc., etc.?
Excuse me, can you repeat it, because I couldn't listen?
Sorry. So the measures of neural signal complexity, like HFT, Lempel-Shift, permutation, entropy, etc., do you have any hypothesis regarding what actually do they relate to in the brain? Like what kind of processes they might be relating to?
Yeah, this is an hypothesis really, as I was commenting, so since it has been observed an increase in plasticity after psychedelics, so we think that this EEG complexity is also a proxy for this plasticity. But for this, we would need a bit more of research and correlational analysis. But also why I'm saying that, because in some measures of TMS EEG, where complexity is applied as well, you can observe this increased complexity when, and this is really a measure of cortical excitability after TMS application.
Thanks. We have another time for another question, comment, anybody? Okay, may I ask all the presenters to come here? While they are coming, I do have a comment for the last presentation and something for all of you, which actually I think shows the utility of having the taxonomy I talked about. And that is that we have data we published in 2013 where we show that a different type of complexity measure of EEG called omega complexity by Gyre was present, but only in experiences that had to do with imaginal events or transcendent, or if you will, unity type of events. Other kinds of states, such as feeling that you were detached from your body and so on, did not show that type of omega complexity. So that was something that people may be able to use as well when they are using psychedelics or other to become even more specific rather than taking the whole measure. As you're leaving, for people who are leaving, I just want to remind you that probably there may still be some journal issues and call for papers way back on the table over there. And may I, if any of you have questions or comments to any of the other presenters, we can start with that.
Yeah, do you mind?
Yes?
I may have missed it. But in your talk, when you were describing about the baseline complexity correlation with the change, the increase in complexity in the acute state, what was the exact mechanism of that? Instead of just being a single increase, it was a proportional increase.
We referred to the paper in 2024 that I was commenting by Huten, so where it says the microdosing effect depends on the cognitive state baseline. So depending on your cognitive state, the effect will be one or the other. So what we're trying to do is to measure the complexity at baseline and see if there is a relationship. We were expecting a linear relationship with the change in complexity, so that so the measure at baseline influences how the change is after.
But what's the mechanism of that? Do you know? Do you think?
What was the mechanism of that? If we use complexity as a proxy for plasticity, so that you have different plasticities at the beginning, so basically you have those that show more plasticity at baseline, so will show a larger change after in the doses.
Thank you.
But this is a hypothesis. So
Anybody else for any of the presenters? Okay, now let me open it to you. Any questions or comments? Yes, way back there.
Hi, Etzel. It's me, Immanuel.
Hello.
I just want to comment on your taxonomy. Why is the ordinary waking state missing? Wait, before I talk. I really object to the ordinary waking state being used as a normative state. I like to see it as simply another alteration of consciousness, and because it's not necessarily an optimal state, even though we use it as a normative state. Of course, it's not normative for many people because their baseline state might be quite different. So I think in a taxonomy, I wouldn't center out the ordinary waking state because it was actually completely missing from your taxonomy.
Because the taxonomy is a taxonomy of altered states, and we purposefully define it as something that parts from. But if you read the paper, we acknowledge that there is wide variety in what we called ordinary or baseline states. We are also going to do a dimensional type of classification where we are going to add the range of ordinary baseline state with all those 8. And then you will be able to see the similarities or differences with each one of them. But we thought one would have to go into so much detail to talk about the variety of differences of people who are very visual with those who are not visual at all, and so on, that it would detract from coming up with a taxonomy that at least talks about what, for most people in our culture, would seem to be different type of states. So that is the reason. Anybody else? Please, there is one way up here.
I have questions to 2 speakers. Is that okay? One's about the Beyond Healing retreat. Are the participants already decided? Like, is everything planned? Oh, sorry.
The second retreat, we are looking for people that would be interested in participating. So if anyone was interested, I'd be happy to give you information.
Okay. The other question is about the tiling software. Is it the software itself? I mean, is it the solving algorithm that's 76 lines of JavaScript?
Oh, it was like, I looked at it yesterday. It was like a 97-line JavaScript class, but yes.
Okay, and what's the complexity of the solving algorithm?
Oh, it's honestly like, I'm not a complexity expert. I would have to like go and look that up. But if I remember from the slide, I think the sparse, see that's the thing is I don't know what kind of like graph cut thing the DMT state might necessarily induce. My best guess was that it would do something called a sparse cut. I think that one's either like NP hard or NP complete. But when you run that on like a graph that's made up of just triangles that is just completely planar, I think it might lose its complexity or something. I wasn't able to like get down into it. But I'm also unable to design a stimulus which somehow, you know, loops back on itself through the screen, and like I can only build planar graphs. That's the issue. Yeah. I can talk about this more afterwards.
Yeah, I'd love to.
Thank you. There is one over there. Yeah.
So yeah, for you again, in general, are there well-known, I mean, there are like consistent kind of structures that you may hallucinate under psychedelics. Are there already, how much has this been like studied in terms of, are there mathematical problems that you can describe formally that like under the psychedelic state I mean that was kind of what you were investigating, whether there's like a certain problem you solve. Mm-hmm. And I mean maybe also in what time and stuff, but that's like the next level of it. But is that area formally studied? I mean you're doing it kind of.
Not at all. As far as I know, no one's doing it. I mean, people are constructing, the best example I could find was that visual stimulus by Mark Changzi, which is intended to be used sober. Like, the best I can think of is like I've read amazing sort of reports from before LSD was banned for research in the United States in the late 1960s. There was a sort of informal research thing done where they gave it to a bunch of like scientists, mathematicians who were then, I think it was actually like, I think they gave peyote to these people, mescaline, and who were then instructed to like work on whatever their favorite hard problem that they were trying to solve through their line of research was. And there's some like great descriptions of like shape rotation type stuff that these people are up to. Like this guy had this great description of these electron orbitals he was trying to visualize, but it's all mental stuff. I'm yet to see any like actual psychophysics that's trying to solve things like this. I mean, I think it's going on sober all the time. It's just that DMT happens to alter subjective experience enough that it's noticeable, and you can then build a discretized mechanism for it to solve, such that you can like make meaningful statements about complexity classes that then convince people who think about computers all day long. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. There is one just.
Yeah, thank you very much. 2 questions for Keith. I really appreciated your application, the application you suggested, and I was wondering, in relation to that stages model that you presented, is it easy, or how do you do the decision that somebody's healed and can move to the next stage, because sometimes that might be a little bit tricky. And also wondering if the participants had different experience in terms of using psychedelics before, and whether you've seen any differences based on that.
Thank you. For the first retreat, we did not have a very formal definition of what needed to be completed to be so-called done with healing and ready to move beyond. But essentially, we used the amount of spiritual, personal work that people had done as a marker for having laid down a foundation. And to be quite honest, we also did interviews over Zoom and just used our intuition and clinical experience to get a sense of whether the person would fit with the type of group we were trying to get together. And then, I apologize, what was the second question?
Yeah, whether there was difference in terms of experience to using psychedelics, yeah.
Yeah, there were some people who, everyone had to be fairly experienced because we wanted to make sure that they could, A, tolerate psychedelics without running into trouble at a retreat center in another country, and B, that they, at the risk of using psychedelic space or psychedelic state as a term, given the talks today, that they could navigate, that they knew how to work psychedelics and knew how to navigate psychedelic states and wouldn't end up with an ontologic shock or a difficult, and that also was just a judgment call. But so people were moderate to very experienced with psychedelics prior to coming to the retreat.
Thank you.
Thanks. Somebody else? There is.
For Pascal, I mean, you talked about also, the perhaps neural correlates of like when psychedelics, like that can be predictive of when psychedelic experiences are not so great. Is this an area, I mean, I would assume it's an area that's been, I would imagine, studied quite a bit, no? Like in terms of like what the last presenter was saying, maybe, I mean, not if it's just like a complexity number is like, that's like way too one-dimensional to predict probably some things, but like how much is that studied, that field?
Yeah, well, I mean, there isn't, as far as I know, I mean, maybe these guys can correct me, there isn't like an explicit study looking dedicatedly at what some neural predictors maybe of specifically challenging psychedelic experiences, but also, I didn't really elaborate it on the end of my talk there, but enduring challenging psychedelic, the enduring challenges afterwards. Yeah, certainly, your talk was relevant in terms of the complexity and looking at the complexity as a predictor of baseline complexity, predicting what you found as increased complexity in the acute state, but that's not specifically looking at challenge. It's like the qualitative level or any challenges thereof, or the enduring changes. Obviously, you can infer some of the qualitative experience, which will come of increased in complexity, like correlation with other metrics of like enhanced richness of phenomenological experience and stuff, and therefore like intensity. And if that's, but we don't know the content, of that. Yeah, what else I'd say? Yeah, I mean, but there's going to be simple ways of doing that. Like there's going to be data there already available. There's going to be, I had on my last slide, just looking at previous studies that there have been of neuroscience studies of psychedelics, which would have included a baseline measure, as they usually do, and then correlating that with whatever phenomenology that they found in a kind of, this neurophenomenological kind of way. So that's going to be a relatively easy thing to do if anyone was interested in doing that.
Let me also comment on this, because I think there is a really interesting pattern across areas of research. And you sort of alluded to it when you were talking about the paper by Ade, who was talking about being defensive, being neurotic, being a predictor of negative experiences. Bruce Grayson, when describing near-death experiences, found the same. I did a study with highly hypnotizable people. These were only 12, but the only 2 people who had negative experiences across sessions were the people who scored considerably lower in a scale called Barron's ego strength, which means they have
ego strength?
Barron, B-A-R-R-O-N. But generally, this is an old MMPI kind of scale that talks about being defensive, being nervous, being anxious, and so on. So right now, I have a project with Michiel van Elk from Leiden, University of Leiden, where we are going to see if that is a good predictor of people having bad experiences when they go into a mushroom type of coffee shops in the Netherlands, where that can happen. But I think that is an area that is worth paying a lot more attention. And that is a sort of proximal kind of predictor. I would speculate that probably one would find that maybe bad attachment experiences might be predictive of a person not being able to integrate a sense of unity or closeness, of feeling overwhelmed by it. But I think that's a very interesting area that it has been almost not researched systematically. And I would predict that psychological predictors are going to be far more specific at this point, at least, than neural predictors. Because with neural predictors, let's say when you take an fMRI, sometimes the correlation between different studies is 0. So depending on what you do, they may not be predictive at all. So
yeah, I mean, just one last thing I'll say to that is that yeah, I mean, my whole PhD was the comparison of near-death experiences and other psychedelic experiences. So if there's similar, it's not surprising that there maybe similar psychological predictors for the kind of nature of experiences for both of them. And I've been in some recent grant proposals that I've done. I've been wanting to do a specific study on predictors of the valence of near-death experiences. Like, what are the predictors, psychological in this case, of these distressing near-death experiences, and that hasn't actually been done in a systematic way at all. And I think the attachment thing is really interesting that you say as well, because I've also considered that in terms of whatever kind of one of these exceptional experiences, but especially whatever MDE psychedelic experience where you're encountering something, some entities beyond oneself, and there are these obvious mirrorings between ourselves, especially developmentally, and our parents and our primary caregivers, and then these kinds of encounters that we may have with things which we may consider like divine or godlike and things. So the attachment thing, I think, can certainly project in that realm as well, and that will be relevant to look at.
And just to be more specific about the attachment, one of the dimensions, for example, in adult attachment inventory and other things like that, are to have unresolved mental states, that people who have had negative, disorganized, anxious, insecure attachment types, they continue to have that kind of going into states that seem to be obsessive, that seem to be painful. And I would imagine that under something that opens them up, they would be even more overwhelmed by those unresolved experiences or mental states. Thank you. Other questions or comments? There's one here.
Hi, this question is for the spiritual activation retreat. I was just curious to know how you define spiritual activation. What does it mean when someone is spiritually activated? And yeah.
Thank you. In this case, we meant the activation to be an experience that showed them how to connect to something that you would categorize as deeply spiritual. This is not a very scientific, this is a spiritual answer to the question. It's an excellent question, and it's one that I think about a lot and relates to the question that I asked about, what is this even that's happening, and is it real? So, I believe in what we're working with goes beyond mindfulness. With all due respect to mindfulness, meditation and the mindful state can be quite beautiful and very helpful for people in their life. But for the most part, and again, also this comes back to what you tell people or what they're expecting to experience. So these are groups of people who are getting together who have a similar pre-existing interest and idea that there is something beyond just the fabric of the physical that they would like to connect with, that they have connected with in a variety of ways, either spontaneously or through meditative and spiritual practices, who want to apply psychedelics to be able to enhance that experience. So the activation is really just activation of one's ability to, on a regular basis, connect with that, was it number 8 in the taxonomy, the unity state, the nothingness state, which I don't perceive at this point to be nothing. It is like a beyond the unity feeling, a place where at first it feels like a vacuum, but my sense is that it may be a place where there's actually quite a bit of data and information. It's just very dense and in a format that feels like just white noise, because for some reason the brain or the mind that I possess is not capable of decoding it. Like it's like if you try to download a file onto and you don't have enough storage, it just doesn't, it cancels the download. But to answer the question, spiritual activation would be activating one's innate ability to connect to that light.
Okay.
Thank you. One final burning question, which is there. Somebody was waving.
Thank you. This question is probably for Etzel. I was comparing in my mind, of course, how do you select people for a psychedelic experience with spiritual intent, and what happens when you work within a setting where there's a set of beliefs, where the system is very closed, has names for everything that's going to happen, and there are certain expectations as well, as in, for example, schools of meditation and so on, beliefs like Hinduism or whatever. So I suppose that framing the experience within a much more open setting, an agnostic setting, or non-religious, organized religious settings, such as those created with psychedelic tools, have a much greater difficulty in integrating the experience than those that are religious. For one reason, for psychological resilience, people who meditate constantly on a regular basis, they do have a psychological resilience that maybe people who have more like a tourist attitude towards recreational drugs and decide to explore also a spiritual way, they are not so structured, not so resilient, and probably don't have such a system of beliefs and names and categories into which to put their own experience, with which to frame their own experience. So my question would be, comparing those two worlds, have there been studies or meta-studies, meta-analysis of studies that compare the experiences and the bad experiences and good experiences obtained in both? Have there been any studies,
Did
that
you say
compare these two worlds?
Was that for Etzel or for me?
Or anybody, I do not...
For anybody who feels qualified to answer, okay.
You!
Okay. So, it's a really good question. So just in that particular study that I was going over just now, we did ask them what their kind of metaphysical beliefs were, I think, because I wasn't involved in the original survey, but it wasn't like what their religious affiliations were before and after, as far as I know. So there's no like clear-cut answer. But in my field study that I did with DMT, like there were two, so we had like 36 people, but there were two which I think emblemized something that you're talking about, and they both actually discussed that. And agreed that one of them had a very, very traumatic kind of experience, really, in some enduring manner, and he had no prior religious belief, or he was an atheist, ultimately, and materialist. Whereas the other one was actually engaged very deeply in the Barquina, like syncretic Brazilian ayahuasca-using religion. And he had he navigated it just like with flying colors, So they can kind of emblemize this dichotomy there, and that they agreed that especially the one that was engaged in Cardeña, that was why, because they had this understanding. But in terms of the study that I talked about today, they were it wasn't as simply as clear cut as like they didn't have the ontological framework beforehand, and therefore they had all these difficult experiences. It was maybe in some of the cases, but actually a lot of them, what was one interesting finding was that they were in retreat settings, like neo-shamanic retreat type settings, or just with a neo-shaman in that kind of context, and they were embracing this other kind of cosmovision, and so we're more than sympathetic to that, maybe engaged in that subculture or whatever, and yet they still had these very challenging experiences which endured in this existential way, and they, and I think part of that is due to like cultural incongruence, actually, rather than ontological incongruence. Yeah, so that's something I'd say. I don't know if...
This might be a little bit indirectly related to the question, but I mean, I've consented a large number of people for psychedelic studies, people who are coming to seek treatment for whatever that's being studied in. And the consent forms have like a whole slew, pages and pages about the possible risks, which are all pretty much what happens during the acute experience on the day of the dosing. And they already know stuff like that's going to happen. It's good to, for them to know that their senses will be altered, because it could be frightening if they were not prepared. But uniformly, the number one concern that people express is there any chance I won't come back? And thankfully, that's very rare. I do think, a lot of my work with the spiritual stuff is about trying to put a framework around, which is, a colleague of mine said, "Oh, it's really good to see that you guys are trying to apply a framework to psychedelic experiences." And then he corrected himself and said, or trying again to reapply, since, in traditional uses of psychedelics, they weren't used out of context. They were used in ritual or ceremonial context. So we're trying to learn from that. I don't think that's a huge, that's not an absolute safeguard. And over time, I think the more that you, ideally people would get to know their mind somehow, whether it's through meditation or spiritual or religious or psychotherapy or psychoanalysis, develop some sense of their inner life before they went to the jungle and did 5-MeO, or, there are very powerful medicines out there, and people are just diving into them. But in the 1960s, that's not what happened either, right? People got introduced to their inner self by happening into psychedelics and launching off, and most of them, thank God, were okay afterwards. And then they said, wait, this is quite interesting. I'd like to go back to this, but without taking a bunch of drugs all the time. And they found whatever flavor of way to understand that part of themselves once they had, discovered it. I think that's the framework.
And if I just may add quickly, I do not know of any meta-analysis that would have seen that. I would doubt that just, for example, having a religious set of beliefs would necessarily be positive, because I think that in an experience like any with psychedelics or something like that, you may find something that does not go along with the dogma. I would put my money on traits, more psychological traits, such as openness to experience. Is the person going to be able to do it? A tolerance to ambiguity, and perhaps not having a very bad history where you have those disorganized, unresolved mental states, so that they won't flourish in the midst of an altered state. But all of these are worth studying, and as far as I know, we have almost no studies about it. Yeah, and that would be. Thank you for being here. Thank you to the presenters. Have a good evening. Buenas noches. Buonanotte. Thank you. Pascal, do you want this? It's.